Hey, good morning, Prince Ram. How are you doing?
Good. Doing
Yeah,
Yeah,
well.
doing well over here as well.
it's great. So, quickly to set context, we are starting this series that we call India to the World, and this is like our first show, podcast, webinar, whatever you want to call it, where we want to bring in people from India and around the world who are engaged in building for cross-border trade, exports, imports, logistics, and talk about areas of interest and problems and challenges and opportunities that are coming up for the global trade environment globally, but also in particular specific to businesses in India looking to sort of grow their business, right? So thanks a ton, Prince Graham, for joining. So on the panel today we have Graham Anderson. Graham is a co-founder at Importal. He started his cross-border journey at Flexport, and now he's building Importal as a leading tech-enabled, AI-driven cross-border trade compliance company. They're a young startup growing very, very rapidly, and they are also a very trusted partner for Xindus on the India to US lane. So Graham, thanks a ton, and welcome you to the India to the World webinar. And then we also have on the panel with us Prince Ghosh. Prince is a co-founder and CEO at Factor Quality. Factor Quality is a startup which was working was in D2C brands sourcing from around the world and giving them the quality and compliance layer to drive their global sourcing. Factor Quality has been acquired now by Petra, which is a global commerce enabler, and Prince continues to build on their mission of building for cross-border commerce now in this sort of new environment, right? I'm Saurabh. I'm one of the co-founders at Xindus. I'm also the CEO of the business. As you know, at Xindus, we are building for cross-border trade and building for Indian small, medium-sized exporters, Indian brands looking to trade globally. And we are building Xindus One, which is a single technology platform where you can run all of your global trade operations, starting with shipping, trade compliance, and marketplace operations. And then, every month, every week, we keep deepening that platform. So that's for introductions. That's done. Coming to the agenda for the day, all of us have been super busy, super excited, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, with all the changes in tariff which have come our way from the US this year, right? And therefore, we thought we should do a full session on what has really transpired in the last 4 5 months with all of these changes. Where has that left us in terms of the lay of the land today, and what tariffs are actually in place, and how do all these changes change or impact cross-border trade operations and opportunities globally and specifically for Indian brands and merchants, right? So that's what we're going to try and cover over the next, say, 40 45 minutes. Graham, I'll start with you. Given you're in the thick of it, why don't you give us a rundown on what has really been happening, right? Because it's been too breakneck to take to sort of cover and understand what's really the lay of the land today. Yeah. So I leave it to you. Take us through the changes in tariff, the reciprocal tariffs, the pauses on that. Are these stacked or not? Special sectors like auto and steel. What's happening there? Are there any exemptions? So if you could just take us through, what's really happening.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so things have changed dramatically in 2025 in comparison to previous years. I think the most important one is obviously tariffs, right? That is impacting every brand across that is importing into the United States. And it started off with a 10% baseline tariff, in April, that slowly advanced as trade discussions continue to evolve. But where we sit today is there's still a baseline tariff that is impacting every country that is importing into the United States, with China having more impactful tariffs, really driving it home. And I think it's really important that, this was just a few months ago that we had this tariff established, and there was a 90-day pause put on for the country-specific rates, right? India had a higher rates and Vietnam had a different rates, but they really simplified it and said, hey, we're just going to baseline tariff this. That changes on July 19th. So we only have a handful of weeks left for countries to start making deals with the US. There are some rhetoric in the market that certain countries have obtained deals and they're just working through the details. But I think it's super important that, higher tariffs are coming in the next 3 weeks, or if you're importing or exporting from a country that gets an advantageous rate, you'll see a lower rate coming there. So I'd say that's really important, just baseline tariff, not looking at commodities, just what's impacting the industry as a whole. And then regards to really the steel and aluminum tariffs, that's been quite a tricky one to deal with. And basically the way to look at it is if you're importing that has any sort of steel or aluminum content, U.S. Customs is going to be hitting you with a 232 tariff. Really important change that just happened for a lot of commodities was Customs is now applying a duty based on the percentage of steel and aluminum, where historically it was just, is it made of steel and aluminum? Great, you get this 20% base tariff. Now, as you can really kind of start to figure out the content base of your product and pay a lesser tariff than maybe you had been over the last 4 months. So that's steel and aluminum. That's been a big one driving home. And I think for all of us sitting here, the de minimis change, right? Now, China, Hong Kong, you cannot utilize Type 86 de minimis for countries of origin. I think that there's going to be more changes coming in the market. Customs has indicated that simply they're waiting for some system changes to be put into place before possibly eliminating Type 86 as a service type into the United States. So something that we're tracking very closely with Customs and other government agencies to ensure that we're staying on top of this. And then a big one that kind of went underneath the scenes that impacts me as a customs broker is that Type 86 is now a prior to arrival filing. And if it has arrived, you have to do a formal informal clearance. If you're working with Xindus and you're working with any other forwarder out there, you need to ensure that Type 86 is filed before the goods arrive. Otherwise, you're going to end up paying duties and fees on the cargo that you thought was duty free. And then the last one is really just U.S. Customs ramping up enforcement, right? So I think it's very important to note that we are dealing with a government agency when you import in the United States, right? This is a federal agency who has a tremendous amount of case law to be able to really identify that you did something wrong and there's no way of circumventing it. And I think the important piece to remember here is Customs has you on the hook for auditing up to 5 years after you import your cargo. So you may be moving quickly, trying to make quick decisions, but always keep that top of mind that your import today, once it clears customs, it's not done. There is 5 years of legal ability for Customs to come and knock on your door and collect back taxes and penalties. So those are really the big ones, Rob, that we've been really tracking on our end.
Sure. Thanks for that, Graham. A couple of questions, sort of follow on from there, and then Prince, I'll come to you as well. And then I think this is of great interest to most of the audience here. So today, right, let's say this black T-shirt that you're wearing, if someone was importing this from India versus importing it from China, what is the delta in the tariff, given that, in Trump 1, there were some additional China tariffs, and this year as well, there were some additional China tariffs, and then there is the baseline reciprocal tariff, which is applicable to everyone, right? So all put together, as we sit today, pending the trade deals which will happen, what is the delta on a product, say, importing in from India versus, say, importing it from China?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that has made everybody really confused today. So the way to look at it today is that for the Chinese market specifically, if you're importing from China, you're subject to a plethora of tariffs, maybe some legacy ones. So the ones to really keep an eye on is Section 301 tariff, which can range from 7.5% to 25%. We'll say 25% for the sake of this conversation. Then there's the IEEPA tariff, which is kind of the fentanyl tariff, which is a 20% baseline. So now we're at 45%. And then we have the baseline reciprocal of 10%. So just off the bat, if you're importing it from China, you're going to be subject to a 55% tariff in the market based on the commodity. And that is a very high tariff to have to deal with. Now, on the other side, if you are importing cargoes from India, let's say, it is simply the reciprocal tariff plus the general duty that I didn't discuss on the previous one. But really, there's a 45% difference in tariff rate from importing from China, importing from India. And that is a huge difference. That is something that drives businesses to make really big strategic changes. And in our opinion, we see that as a very smart strategic pivot, as we don't see the tariffs easing anytime soon out of China. But we do see the United States making more deals with countries like India to lower some of these tariffs.
And again, right, of course, like you said, some of these tariffs were legacy and some of them came this year. So net, relative to the world, there is about 20%, 25% additional tariff on China as we sit today compared to what was there on, say, December 31 or January 20.
Yeah, that's
right?
correct.
And
Yep.
that means there are additional sectors or products which are now more meaningful to buy from somewhere else compared to say China, right? And that's where, Prince, I want to come to you, right? So you sit in the middle of all of that buying that people are doing, right? Especially D2C brands,
Totally.
right? I know a lot of work that you guys do is in that space, right? So with de minimis gone, and this additional sort of 25% tariff, the 45% delta, what are you seeing with your buyers, with your brands, right? How are they looking at this? What sectors are impacted? What sectors are not impacted? Take us through.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for that, Sarah. So the quick background for everyone listening again is Factory Quality is a global third-party quality control testing and compliance marketplace for consumer brands. So as brands source products from factories across the world, we can actually at Factory Quality help them audit those factories and inspect that inventory. Factory Quality, like Sarah mentioned, was acquired by a company called Pietra. Pietra is actually a sourcing marketplace at its core that helps consumer brands and importers find suppliers and factories across India, China, Vietnam, many different parts of the world. Historically, large parts of the direct consumer goods sector sourced and relied on importing from China to be able to make those businesses work. I think over the last 2 to 3 months, starting in March and April and to today, there's obviously been a ton of uncertainty as the administration has gone back and forth on what it believes import duties should be across different countries. I think there was a really big movement in April and early May for brands to scramble to try and move large parts of production out of China. I think a lot of brands tried, and a lot of them, in many cases, saw this as an opportunity to even re-domesticate production and to kind of ask the question of, hey, is there a world where we can truthfully bring this product back to the US? I think a lot of those consumer goods companies found that the economics just unfortunately don't work, and that the United States, as great of a country as we live in, just doesn't have production capabilities for a lot of production processes that are required to make goods. And if you think about it, in the consumer goods space, you have kind of commoditized goods and then you have specialized goods. A lot of the at least direct-to-consumer movement has kind of prized itself on building specialized goods. As an example, I spoke to a brand that, I won't name the name, but everyone probably knows well, a large up-and-coming direct-to-consumer cookware brand that at one point tried to move production of their final cookware back to the US and realized that there's actually no country except for Japan, in their case, that can actually make the steel that's needed to use in their cookware. And they would have to change the entire production process and the product fundamentally, which changes the value proposition, which changes the marketing, which changes its resonance with customers. And so I think where a lot of the market has kind of ended up is saying, look, maybe China isn't going to be our long-term dependent trading partner. Is there a world where we can figure out a way for Vietnam, for India, for Indonesia, for other countries across Southeast Asia to kind of play at least a second pole position of saying, look, if there's ever a world where we're completely handicapped from Chinese production, we at least have someone else to fall back onto that has production capabilities and processes. Maybe it's not as cheap. Maybe, our gross margin or gross profit takes a hit compared to manufacturing in China, but it's better than not having any means of production at all. And I think that was the massive fear that a lot of companies had throughout March and April this year.
Thanks for that, Prince. A few follow-on sort of questions. Where are you seeing, or how are you seeing different sectors or product sort of categories getting impacted, right? So fashion and apparel, home decor, jewelry, leather, toys, electronics, consumer electronics, right? So consumer goods or consumer consumption goods across the swath, right? Where are you seeing more movement in terms of people more urgently or imminently looking at driving sourcing away, say from China, if not completely, partially? Yeah.
Totally. I think the first answer is every category wanted to try. I think the reality of what has happened is not every category has a feasible path or kind of roadmap to being able to do so. So, for example, I speak to a bunch of consumer electronics companies, and a lot of them realized over the course of like a deep exploration, there's just really actually not a pathway of manufacturing a lot of consumer electronics in countries outside of China for production constraint reasons, for raw materials reasons, for cost of goods reasons. So I think what's ended up happening is companies that operate in adjacent verticals like apparel or footwear or cookware are some of those verticals that have had a bit more success in moving production to Vietnam, to India. You see a lot of, I at least see a lot of categories like baby, kids, toys sort of goods being manufactured more and more in India. A lot of FMCG is moving and has moved already to India. And I think one of the big benefits is countries like India that have had a history in manufacturing and production of FMCG are able to take on large parts of those product categories. So this is that's a bit of a snapshot of kind of what I've at least seen amongst our customer base.
And how are people sort of doing this? Is this change fairly rapid? Is this very tactical and short term right now, more sort of as a business contingency measure? Are people saying that, hey, this holiday season I want to be 50% from somewhere other than China? How are people looking at it? What's the pace of this change, if at all?
Yeah, great question. I think again, like the consumer goods and importer market has been going through such a whiplash that I think in Q2, for the beginning part of Q2, every brand was under pressure from the board level down to say, how do we create a alternative and redundant strategy? Like, what are we doing here? How are we diversifying, putting all of our eggs in the China basket? And I think over the course of this past quarter, it's been an absolutely insane. I cannot actually believe that it's only been one quarter. It feels like, it's been years, but literally over the course of this quarter, I think a lot of brands have said, okay, let's hold our horses. Let's not make any rash decisions. Let's take a second, breathe. And actually trying to understand what are true and viable alternatives. The truth, Saurabh, is I don't think that there's a prescriptive right or wrong or timeline, right? I think there are certain companies that use this as an opportunity to bite the bullet and make a decision that they've wanted to make for years and say, it's not even worth the uncertainty. Let's get out of there altogether. And I think there's other brands that'll either be forced to make a decision based on what happens over the next couple of weeks, or will ride it out throughout this holiday season. In production for upcoming holiday season, as you guys know, is starting to happen right now over the next couple of months. A lot of that inventory will be put onto planes and ships into September and October ahead of November and December holiday sales. And so, for many of those brands, the ship might have sailed, and so the next chance that they'll get an opportunity to think about reshoring seriously will be, towards November and December, after all that inventory is now on sales and distribution teams' hands, and then supply chain planning and production teams get a chance to revisit strategic decisions.
Makes sense. Dan, what are you seeing in the same context, right? Basis all the customers that you work with, where are you starting to see more diversification in sourcing, or more urgent action around sort of sourcing diversification?
I think what we're seeing on our end is brands kind of recognizing that there is tariff engineering opportunities where you can be smart about how you make the product that can lead to better decisions on what is the tariff outlook. And I think the most common one you hear is Converse's example of importing their all-star Chuck Taylor shoes and implementing a felt bottom of 50%, which categorizes it as a slipper, which has significantly less tariffs than a traditional shoe. So we're just seeing brands kind of wake up to the fact that tariffs are established at the production stage and not when your broker clears customs. So to be really smart about it and start poking around corners and identifying, can we make a material composition change or a knit or woven change to lower our tariff impacts? And I think to bounce it back to Prince, really when you're making those decisions, though, quality still has to be top of mind, right? You don't want to degrade quality of your product in order to save some tariffs. Obviously, that's amazing to have lower landed cost, but you definitely don't want to upset the consumer and start importing a net new product that may have some implications down the road.
Sure. And so to both of you, right? I know both of you in your orgs leverage a lot of technology to help people work through these changes, right? And maybe both of you, if you could just give us some examples or even share with us, right, some of the technology which is sort of coming out for US buyers as they look at sort of going through these changes, which is of course very instructive and indicative for the Indian sellers as well, right? As they look at how the buyers are approaching this problem. Yeah, Prince, maybe you want us to go ahead, and then maybe Graham, you want to add to that.
Yeah, 100%. And Saurabh, could you maybe clarify a little bit more on the question of what specifically you'd be looking for?
So the question really is that with all of this change that is coming or has come on the tariff side, today people are evaluating multiple markets and multiple factories from a sourcing standpoint, and they're to the best of my understanding leveraging a lot of technology to be able to make these choices, right, to assist them in this journey, right? So what is the sort of usage of technology that you yourself are seeing or deploying to help people with this transition?
Totally. So I mean, I think there's two parts of this, right? The first, as Graham just said, a lot of your tariff implications start at the production stage, and the production stage really begins at the sourcing stage. And so I think let's talk about two types of technology at two different parts of the supply chain. The first is around sourcing and production, and the second is after the goods are manufactured, what does that mean for the import of goods ultimately into the US or into other countries? On the sourcing and production side, when you think about kind of the evolution of sourcing over the last, let's call it 100 years, right? After the advent of the modern age of global trade, sourcing and production was historically very agent or broker driven. You have large trading companies like Li and Feng that started the process of cross-border trade and served as agents and brokers, enabling importers to find and source factories and suppliers from other parts of the world. Then, over the course of the late 90s into the early 2000s, the big kind of revolutionary impact was the creation of Alibaba, right? And Alibaba at its core, a lot of the world forgets this, but at its core, Alibaba was technology not actually built for buyers to find suppliers, but ultimately was actually really built for suppliers to sell and market their goods to the rest of the world. And it's ultimately the same, end impact of transaction and trade of goods. But Alibaba, for the first time, allowed these billions of Chinese factories to put themselves on a global map and to enable an online commerce experience for people to purchase inventory from those factories. And that was kind of the second wave of sourcing production technology. And the concept of brokers and agents still very much exists. And, sourcing is very much still a high touch kind of services driven business in many ways. But I think the really kind of interesting opportunity over at least the last year and a half or so is with the new age of what's happening in the AI space and agentic kind of commerce experiences, the ability for an agent to go out and do work on behalf of you. I think the thing that's really fascinating is the role or the ability that AI and AI agents specifically can play in navigating large swaths of the supply side of a marketplace on behalf of the demand side. And so, for example, at Pietra, one of the things that we've done is we were originally built as a traditional marketplace, very much Alibaba style. And over the last 3 months, we've sought out to disrupt and disintermediate our own marketplace and turn our traditional sourcing experience into a much more agentic first experience. And so now someone can come to Pietra's website, they can see a search box, kind of like a chat GPT like experience, and just type in, hey, I want to find a factory that makes me silicone phone cases in China or Japan or Vietnam. And the AI agent will actually do the hard work or the dirty work of navigating the supply side of the marketplace on behalf of the demand side. And so that's kind of the latest and greatest of what's happening. And I think what this will unlock is kind of a new gold rush of people being able to find factories at a degree of ease that they've never been able to, with the speed of software, but kind of the high touch of almost like a services like experience. And then similarly, I think a lot of import compliance and trade compliance has fallen a very similar sort of path where it started as a very services heavy, high touch industry. And I think there will always be a services component to this industry. But as Graham and the team over there at Importal are building, there's 100% an opportunity for technology to play a role in preserving that services experience, but doing it at a 10 times faster and cheaper way by using AI agents underneath the hood to power large parts of the operational infrastructure.
Sure, makes sense. And before I go to Graham, just to sort of follow on something that you mentioned, right? So you said, of course, right, part of the story is baked in prior to production, and part of the story kicks in, post production, right? So the prior to production story, in your view, if you could give some examples on how people are revisiting how they design, source, buy to get the best at the pre-production stage.
At the end of the day, really revisiting just how the product is made from its, from nuts and bolts. What is it made of? How is it composed? Can I make any strategic changes? And leveraging AI to be able to get to that final resolution. I think in the incumbency of customs and trade compliance, there was always a person in a seat driving that decision. And now with technology being implemented, you don't need that person any longer to make those smart sourcing decisions. Just want to touch on that. Go ahead, Prince.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, really not much more to add. Maybe the last thing to kind of mention here is there's actually something really interesting that happens even before the sourcing process started, which is the actual product design and development process, right? And I think that the thing that people often kind of mistake in global supply chains is that these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step discrete processes that happen kind of one ahead of another. And in reality, the way that global trade and production actually works is you have different teams working in tandem to ultimately meet a business or financial goal of the company. If anything, it's actually the CFO or the VP of finance at a brand that runs the ship, right? Where they say, look, I know that you want the product to be designed in this sort of way, but we really need to hit this gross profit or gross margin requirement. So can we go back to the drawing board? Can we revisit the product design? Can we revisit the product development and the production process? Okay, if we change the product design, does that mean we can do it with our existing factory? Does that mean we can do it with a new factory? So the way that products are built are really kind of like a give and take. It's not like one team, sets a stone in the sand and says, this is uncompromised. Maybe there are some companies like Apple that are so design led that say, hey, nothing will compromise, the design of this product, and we have to use this grade of aluminum. And supply chain team, like, good luck. It's up to you to figure out, which factory to find in what part of the world that can make this within the finance team's requirements. But I think the reason I say that is because actually it's funny, both my company, Factor Quality, as well as Graham's company, Importal, both start by integrating with a system of record called the PLM, the Product Lifecycle Management Tool, which is really the core system of record that product design and development teams use. And it's the funniest thing in the world because the PLM is truly a kind of like the forgotten horse of supply chain technology, but is where so many downstream decisions then come off of what happens inside of that PLM.
And actually, to what you were saying, right? As we started this conversation, the compliance barriers as they go up, so to speak, right? There are mid to large size businesses who have more capability, more technology, more better organized data, and they can probably navigate some of these changes to that extent better, right? And then there are small to medium sized businesses, whether buyers on the US side or sellers on the India side, right? They are lesser equipped with the right quality of data, technology, etc., to be able to drive these changes, right? And therefore, Graham, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about the compliance side, but to both of you, right? Are you starting to see just buying globally starting to become more difficult for people if they don't have the necessary scale to navigate these changes?
Yeah, Graham, you wanna go first?
Yeah, totally. I mean, on boots on the ground over here, we've seen more customs holds and exams in 2025 than I've seen in the history of working in customs, right? So we're seeing enforcement continue to ramp up. And the best way to look at it is, people look at customs and border protection as protecting our borders, which they do. But this is also a tax collecting agency, right? They are generating revenue for the federal government. So they are going to double click on every import because they know that if they just peel back one or two layers, they'll find a simple mistake that can lead to penalties, to lead to more revenue for the government. So overall, importing in the United States is getting more difficult every single day. And especially if you are importing commodities that are subject to other agencies, FDA, EPA. They've now been empowered by this, the president to really enforce the laws of the land. So the way to mitigate that is before you import some of the United States, lean on Importal and Xindus and Prince, over at Pietra to be able to first solve the compliance puzzle before you say, I'm going to bring this in the US. Making that decision and being proactive is just something that will pay dividends for years to come.
Prince, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would kind of add in here is like to what Graham said, the degree of complexity of kind of operating a brand in this modern world has gone up, 100x. And there seems to be roadblocks that are thrown in front of brands at every single part of a product life cycle, from the design of the product to the development to the sourcing to the production to the shipping and the fulfillment and distribution of the product. And I think the only thing that I'll add is in parallel, though, however, there's been so much investment into technology infrastructure and companies that can make this process easier. All three of us are founders of different supply chain technology companies. 10 to 15 years ago, supply chain technology wasn't a category. It wasn't a thing that venture capitalists looked at as an opportunity. And I think in large part, we have to give credit to Graham's former employer over at Flexport, who really pioneered kind of the category of modern supply chain technology and said that, hey, look, there's actually an opportunity to use software in parallel with services to build a sort of vendor that is next generation and that makes actually life easier for brands and importers that are looking to run and operate in this ever more confusing global world. And so I think that if I were to frame this into advice for any brands listening, it would be, go and find a really good supply chain technology partner. A good one will not just serve as like a discrete point solution, but actually over time will become almost like an advisor. And I think it's actually more critical than ever to think about what is your quote unquote supply chain stack that you're using for every part of the product life cycle. So, yeah.
So Graham, to you, right? I'm super excited about the sourcing tool you guys have built, and maybe if you could talk about that and how that is adding value to the buyer, but can also add value to the seller for them to be able to understand relatively where they are when a buyer is looking at them.
Yeah, totally. We, in reaction to a lot of the chaos that's happened in 2025, we built a country comparison tool, and it's really as simple as you stand up your product in our system, and you can compare between as many countries as you want. But typically, we see between two countries to really understand the delta between importing from those various countries. We have a client of ours who utilized this product over the last couple months, made a strategic decision to pivot out of China into an African nation. And ended up saving over $120,000 on just one shipment, right? So super impactful, but I think it's a very cool tool because this is not the end of it. We're going to see more than ever, different countries have different rates. And if you're not hyper aware of what those rates are, it's just going to impact your bottom line. For the sellers, in India, maybe you're shipping DDP and you're really the one having to eat those import duties. You definitely need to know, right? It's a foreign markets, foreign regulations, things are cryptic even for me as a licensed broker. So utilizing technology, and to Prince's point about finding that right tech stack that blends in the services and that domain expertise as well as automations to really get you across the finish line.
Great. That's wonderful. And on that, right, going to sort of next piece, right? Because of all of this sort of volatility, the higher tariffs on an operational tactical basis every day, right? How are you seeing people work? How has their way of running global sourcing or execution on a day-to-day basis changed, Graham?
Yeah, I think the real big strategic shift that we've seen is companies really shifting to bringing goods in via airplane versus ocean. Typically, shipping LCL was a cheaper option, but the transit time was 30 to 40 days, right? And with these tariffs, there have been an export date and an import date rule set. So companies have found themselves have shipped something weeks ago, but they're going to pay a higher tariff due to transit time. So we've seen a heavy increase in companies shipping via air. So that has been a big reaction that I see lasting for a long time, especially with tariffs about to change again. So that's been the real big strategic shift. And that's pretty tough, right? Because, especially from my seat, I have 45 days on ocean to ask the right questions, to go get the right documents. But with air, it's happening within 24 hours. So you need to be really proactive with your customs broker or your freight forwarder to ensure that you have all the proper documentation. You've crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's to ensure that there are no holds. There's no storage at the airports. All the demurrage that could take place if you're not prepared. So yeah, shifting of transportation type has been the real big one we're witnessing.
Before all of these changes, we were running, imports into JFK as a single airport and distributing across the US from there, sort of regular line hauls. With all this volume increase, today we are directly flying into JFK, we are flying into Chicago, we're flying into San Francisco. Now, all of the inbound fee that Amazon has started now charging. Earlier, you could sort of bring in larger shipments and deliver it to one FBA facility. Now, if you do that, you have a very large inbound fee. So if you have to sort of, work around that inbound fee, you want to do split shipments, which means you have smaller shipments, and that then starts lending itself just better to air shipments in conjunction to these tariffs as well, right? So I think you're right. We ourselves seeing a lot of change away for people who earlier used to do LCL, but in now overall net sort of doing more and more of air. Yeah, absolutely. That's true. What are you seeing, Prince, with the brands that you're working with?
Yeah, for sure. I'll maybe kind of take this from a slightly different angle and say this. I think while I said the statement that I said before, which was, I think it's really important for brands to have a really good technology stack. I think the really important thing to remember for global importers is at the end of the day, supply chain is still a human business and it still is a services business. And I think sometimes that there's so much excitement about technology and like AI and everything else. And, people think that they can just like rip out entire portions of people and OpEx and switch that instead to software tools. At the end of the day, the most important way of working is having someone that you can, at the end of the day, pick up the phone and call when your product is lost, when your factory is not answering, when something goes wrong. And I think the thing that I'll say here is, I think apart from like the tactical changes that people are operationally kind of executing in their supply chain, the biggest sort of value or opportunity that a brand operating can have is by finding a really good set of supply chain partners who don't just act as pure technology layers and try and push their technology down their throats, but who are willing to show up on a call and answer questions and, of course, leverage technology in a smart and easy way for operational excellence, but don't make that the number one priority of the business. I think what we saw, just going back to that last supply chain technology piece, is, without naming names, I think there was a period of time over 2020 through 2024 where a lot of the version one of the 2010 supply chain technology platforms and companies were under a lot of pressure by their investors and their venture capitalists to push the software and SaaS side of their business. And I think what you saw was a lot of lost customer trust, because at the end of the day, like I said, brands want a face and a name that they can call and speak to when shit hits the fan. And unfortunately, in global supply chains, this messy industry we all work in, shit does hit the fan pretty often.
Not the best advertisement for technology supply chain companies, which is where we come from, but it is what it is. You have to sort of take the good with the bad. So I'll come to the sort of last section for this call today, for this chat today. And I'll start with you, Prince, actually, right? You've, of course, got tremendous experience working with factories around the world, buyers in the US, and in our audience today. And of course, right, we'll disseminate this to our 1,000 customers and beyond that to the community, right? With all of the shift happening, right? And if you're a seller factory in India, looking to be on the buying, you want to be sort of, getting the vote to be the sourcing location, right? What is it that you should be ticking the boxes on?
Yeah, great question. I think sourcing ultimately comes down to three things: quality, speed, and cost. And then I'll add like an external circle around all of that, which is customer service. And I think it all starts with, again, that customer service experience. It's funny. It's like very similar to a freight forwarder, compliance broker, QC partner. A factory is a vendor to an importer and a brand. And to exactly what I said before, where like technology is great, but having, a person that you can speak to is ultimately the thing that people look for. Being a really good manufacturing and trading partner is something that I think, factories need to exude to be able to win good business. And then after that, it all comes down to this like holy pinnacle and triangle of quality, speed, and cost. Can you manufacture a high quality product at a cost that makes sense for you and a cost that makes sense for your customer? And can you do it with fast enough turnaround times, good lead times that make sense for end buyers? Like, it is really quite simple as that. I think there's, a lot of tactical things that suppliers can do. Like, for example, you as a supplier have to kind of make a decision to say, hey, look, do we want to be an OEM? Do we want to be an ODM? Do we want to be a CM? If we're a contract manufacturer, do we want to have a very rigid box of production capabilities that we can operate under? Or are we willing to work with other factory partners to subcontract certain projects out so that the brand gets the experience of working with one face in India, but that one face in as a factory in India can actually have other factories underneath it that it can work with or partner with to source product from. So I think those are kind of the big questions as a manufacturer to ask, to say, hey, look, are we positioned as really good trading partners that these brands would look to use and work with? And then I'll just say the one last piece about cost. I think in global production and supply chains, one of the biggest mistakes that vendors can make is being penny wise and pound foolish. And I think what a lot of brands and importers are looking to do is build long-term relationships with partners. And even if there's an opportunity to, gouge the customer a little bit more for a little bit more revenue or profit in the first couple of months of a partnership together, think about the long term. Think about the bet that you're making on this brand. Are they a brand that's going to grow? And do you want that business in the long term? And do you want to continue to grow with that customer? And then use that kind of knowledge and that future facing perception to make decisions of how you want to price your service and your offering today.
One sort of quick follow on, right? So today, let's say when you deal with a factory in China, but most likely you're not dealing with a new factory, you already have relationship. And today, a sort of a newer factory out of India is coming in and talking about potentially being that sourcing partner, right? In terms of how people are presenting themselves on day one, are there some things that they can think of so that, we say the first impression is in some ways the last impression? Of course, there's a journey, right? But still, what are some things that,
Totally.
people could just tactically sort of get right on day one when they're going to someone to potentially be a sourcing partner?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things to really kind of tip a hat to for a lot of Chinese suppliers is they've really nailed, let's call it the quote unquote front office experience. You go to a Chinese supplier, it's a really great, like quite literally physical front office experience that you have, There's someone greeting you. They typically speak native English. It's really easy to communicate, understand their menu of offerings, their production capabilities. They're very encouraging about seeing the factory, doing a factory tour, meeting in person, and building that relationship. And I think very similarly, ironically, the less that you can think of your trading partners as transactional partners and the more that you can think of them as like long-term business relationships and investing in that upfront part of the relationship, I think that is how you build your presence as a strong supply chain partner. So I think truly, either make the effort or hire someone in your front office who's client facing, who is really strong with English language, who can act as kind of that intermediary, as that translator. I'll add one actually last thing. one of the very tactical things that I've seen much more and more common is over time, a lot of factories 20 years ago didn't have product design and development capabilities in-house, and they were purely production partners. Over the last really 10 to 15 years, a lot of Chinese suppliers have invested heavily in product design and development capabilities. And the reason is so that they can work hand in hand on things like tariff engineering and being a design partner to the brand of saying, hey, we will use a higher level of agency to say to you guys, maybe if you want to make this iPhone silicone case, but you want to use a different material and adjust the plastic around the edges, you can actually change the entire cost profile of your product. I think investing in those design and development and client services capabilities is something that Indian factories can benefit a ton from, and is, I think, something that a lot of American, at least, brands and importers seek in a trading partner.
Wonderful. I think that's good. Sort of wrapping up, with you, Graham, before we see if we have some questions. What is the downside of not getting compliance right? How bad can it get? Things change.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. There are plenty of pitfalls. I think the most important one is, customs will fine you based on negligence or gross negligence. Did you break the law unknowingly, or were you making a decision to circumvent tariffs? And both of them end up being around 2.5x of the loss of duties, plus any sort of interest and penalties that can come from that. And you got a $100,000 import coming in, and you're going to owe $10,000 in tariffs. Well, customs is now going to give you a penalty for $20,000 plus, interest and other penalties, and possibly banning you from importing into the United States. The risks are really high. The mistakes that we see most often come down to HTS classification. The world runs on the harmonized system, which is 6 to 8 digits. The United States has a more detailed approach to the tariff schedule, and there can be a lot of nuance and complications by just saying, this is my HS code to my US HTS code. That doesn't always align. And as a result of that, you may be unknowingly paying more or less tariffs than you should be. So we see customs a lot really paying attention to classification. And the other one that's super simple is documentation. There's a bunch of regulations about, hey, there are 10 to 15 data points that are mandatory on your commercial invoice and packing list. And to the point, kind of Prince talking about with, working with your vendor to ensure compliance on the product side, but also on the documentation side. They should understand that if I'm shipping to the United States, these are the X's and O's that need to be on this commercial invoice and packing list to ensure that there's no friction at the port. So I think, to kind of take a step back, it really comes down to documentation and communication with that domain expert overseas in the United States to ensure that everything looks good and that there won't be any problems.
Great, thanks. Of course, we've been open for questions. I don't see too many, but one that I see, and maybe that's a good place to sort of wrap up. Graham, if you could sort of, help summarize, right, once again for Indian exporters, all the tariff changes and what they should have in mind as a takeaway from this.
10% reciprocal tariff currently sitting on Indian-made goods. There will be a change coming for better or for worse, July 19th. So run your good, better, best scenario of current stack of tariffs versus what were they when they first came out. So that's really important to just understand that. And I think as well as to really identify, if you're using type 86 de minimis, what does it look like for me as a brand if that completely goes away? Right now, I need a customs bond. Now I need to have more detailed, sophisticated documentation. So those are really the two big ones: is tariff planning for the reciprocals that are currently in place if you're doing formal and informal already. But if you're doing type 86, just to prepare yourself to what would that change look like as an organization, because it could happen overnight, right? I think we saw that with the Trump administration. These tariffs are hitting quickly. So you could wake up one day and your importing world has a net new norm. So really identifying those good, better, best scenarios is really the best pathway forward. And then just ensuring that's, you understand your tariff implications before you ever buy products. So technology stacks like Importal and others out there, you can really identify my landed cost before you ever make a purchasing decision, so that you're never in a situation where customs is billing you and you're completely shocked. That can all be solved upstream in the supply chain.
So net, right? India is at 10%. China is plus 45 of India as we sort of sit today. There's a delta of around 45. And as July comes, there is excitement, and we'll all see sort of what changes, right? And sort of to summarize again, Prince, coming back to you, two questions. If you could sort of, as a takeaway, what are the categories in which you are seeing the most active shift? I know you said it's factory by factory, brand by brand, but still, where are you seeing the most shift where people are actively sort of looking to move out of China? One, and two, what can people do to list with Petra as a factory? If they want to
Yeah.
participate on your platform.
Great question. I'll answer in reverse order. So first, any supplier is welcome to approach the Pietra platform. If you go on the website and you actually can click sign up as a supplier, you'll get introduced to a member of our supply onboarding and acquisition team, have a chat with them, and then be listed as a profile on Pietra's marketplace. So that's kind of the second answer. To your first question here, Saurabh, I think what we've really seen as the couple of countries that are coming out of this with the most amount of demand kind of aggregating to them, I would say are Korea, Vietnam, and India. I think Korea and Vietnam are in large part using this time period to flex their production capabilities in soft goods, textiles, leather, apparel, those verticals and product categories. And again, I think India is winning a lot of business right now from merchants in injection molded plastics and products that are made as a derivative of injection molded plastics, and then in a lot of consumable product categories. So FMCG, supplements, vitamins. Actually, as an interesting kind of anecdote, I recently met with an American US-based collagen company that's looking to distribute in India, and rather than manufacturing at their existing production plant, they're actually spinning up a new collagen production facility in India because India actually has production capabilities for a lot of these supplement categories. I think those will be some of the emerging kind of victors of the recent the recent changes and disruptions. I think there are certain European and Middle Eastern countries that will win business in very specific product categories. Like, for example, we actually have a decent number of bedding and apparel companies that make home goods that have moved a large part of their production to countries like Turkey and Israel. And we have a few other customers that makes more specialized kind of electronic devices that are higher cost but higher gross margin businesses in countries in Europe. But I think those countries in Southeast Asia I first mentioned, Vietnam, Korea, and India, will be large beneficiaries of what's been happening.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks a ton for your time. I think it's an interesting conversation. Of course, all of us, three of us, we could keep talking about global trade. This is what we do day in, day out. It's a little late in India, around 10 p.m. now. So some people braved the evening and came and listened to us. But we'll share this with the wider community. And I look forward to chatting with you again sometime soon. Thank you. Thanks a ton, Prince and Graham.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.